Boom. Hey, everybody. Oh, I forgot to share my screen. Hey, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. I'm Sam Rohn. Many of you know me. Today, we're going to be reviewing using the RICOH THETA Z1 camera with Adobe Lightroom. Many of you may be familiar with the Z1 camera, but for those of you who are not, it is a compact 360-degree camera that produces excellent quality RAW files, which are not quite up to the resolution of a DSLR, but the color and dynamic range of the images is very, very impressive in single exposure or in HDR, high dynamic range bracketed files, which the camera is also capable of producing. We're going to be editing a few different selections of these in Adobe Lightroom, walking you through some of my favorite tips and tricks. Behind me here, you can see this is a result of a single DNG I shot in Japan back in 2019. And that is basically the summary of what we're going to be doing today. Kellen, where do we go next? Onto my screen. So I share my screen. 1 second, please. Hello, Peter from Germany. Share screen. Boom. And here we are. Okay. Whoops. 1 second. Sorry, guys. Just give me 1 second, please. Oops. Okay. So, I'm sorry, Kellen, where are we starting? What's my next topic? Just keep me a little bit on track here. We're going to start with showing off.
Yeah, why don't we start with walking through kind of your first image and your workflow?
Okay. We're going to start with image I shot in Japan 2 years ago, end of 2019. This is an area in Asakusa, Japan. It's a very important temple complex. It's also it's tourist selfie central for as long as cameras have existed, basically. This was a single exposure shot at very low light. Have to give the screen a second to load, of course, because now that I'm live, everything's loading slowly. And you can see we got very excellent results here in this low light situation. The original out of camera, and I did this by underexposing the image quite a bit. This is the JPEG that came out of camera. I exposed this image so that the highlights would not be blown out. And I did not worry so much about the shadow areas, as I know that I can recover easily, 2 to 3 stops without too much noise from a single exposure DNG. We can get more from an HDR DNG, which we'll look at later. So again, this is the JPEG that came out of the camera. This is the, this is the final result from the DNG, where we can see, if we want to put these side by side, we can see just, how much we can get back from the dark areas here. Again, with the DNG, we can also correct white balance as needed, et cetera, et cetera. So to create this image, right, like I said, I shot a DNG file. The camera also produces a JPEG preview, but it will also give me, and of course, I just hit the wrong button in Lightroom. Here we go. This is the DNG after a bit of processing. Let me just take it back to its beginning and make a snapshot of the current state and then bring it back to the import state. This is what the DNG file looks like out of camera. And I'm going to just go back to the last setting where you can see, let me just get that out of my way. We can see some of the settings I have here, if anyone's curious. A little bit of sharpness. I basically set the white balance as, in this case, it got it right, but you can set the white balance as needed. I added about 1.5 stops of exposure, a bit of the contrast, the highlights and shadows, texture clarity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Didn't use a point curve here. Enhanced the sharpness a little bit. One thing always important with the DNG files prior to stitching is to remove chromatic aberration. That will fix, it's going to be hard to see here, but it will enhance detail towards the edge of the images if you don't know what chromatic aberration is. Anyway, taking this image back to its beginning state, right? And I'm going to try to match what I ended up with. We basically just bring the exposure up a little bit till we see the midtone areas are about where we want them. We then bring the highlights down a little bit so they're not blown out. Then the shadows. Bring the shadows up about where we want. We can play with the white balance a bit at this point. I'd say make it all a little bit cooler. Give me more of the look I want. I like to add a little bit of clarity as well. Now let's go back to the highlights. Here we can see we still a bit too bright in the highlight. So we're going to bring that down a little bit, right to about there. Play with the contrast till it looks the way we want. Whoops. Add a little bit more saturation, not too much. I like to leave the tone curve alone at this point. Sharpening can be a two-step process. If we look here at 100%, you'll see we're starting to get a lot of noise in the areas that we've recovered shadow detail. So we are going to, use a noise reduction slider to bring that to a place where some of that noise starts to go away. In this case, it's about 60. We're going to then use sharpening to bring back a little bit of sharpness. If you hold down the Option key while sliding, you should always be at 100% while sharpening. If you hold down the Option key or the Alt key on Windows while sharpening, you will see that you get a black and white preview, which lets you more easily see what is being sharpened. You don't want to overdo it. You don't want to underdo it. You can always add more sharpness and add more noise reduction in individual areas using the brush tools, which we'll get into later. So you generally want to just make it look good for the whole image here. Again, the Option key will help us see what we're doing here. Masking will prevent it from showing too much on areas where you don't want it to show. Chromatic aberration, I forgot to check that before, but this is a good example. You see here we have a light that has this red and blue kind of halo on it. And when I check the chromatic aberration box, right, that goes away. Chromatic aberration is a somewhat complex subject, but to make life easy, always check the chromatic aberration box on unstitched images. Never use the chromatic aberration checkbox on stitched equirectangulars. Chromatic aberration is a function of lens distortion, and it cannot be properly corrected in an equirectangular image. If you try to remove chromatic aberration in an equirectangular, you would introduce other artifacts that you don't want. There are other types of color fringing that we will fix in equirectangular when we get onto that stage. So, Kellen, do we have any questions so far?
I'm going to back up for 1 second here, a little less technical, but can you tell us a little bit kind of about the benefits of shooting with, you know, the Theta Z1 as opposed to DSLR?
Sure. Theta Z1 is about the size of the battery of my DSLR. When I was a younger man, I was more than happy to walk around with 20 pounds of DSLR hanging off my neck every day. But these days, I pretty much only do that for work. The Z1, I should have put it right next to me. 1 second, but now I have it in my hand. Let me just switch away from screen sharing for a second. The Z1 camera right here. The DSLR is right here. The DSLR produces better results. You know, I mean, it's $4,000 body with a $2,000 lens compared to a $1,000 complete unit with 2 cameras, produce better results. But the DSLR can be a large and intimidating rig. You pretty much, unless you're an expert with handheld DSLR panoramas, handheld DSLR panoramas, you really need a tripod and panorama head to get a good result with this sort of camera. With the Z1, you need selfie stick size tripod, which is much more practical to carry around with you, most days. And for many situations, if I was shooting a historical museum architecture where I needed tremendous detail, or a historical church where I need to zoom on the paintings all the way up in the ceiling, you'll get more resolution with the DSLR. But for shooting tours of apartments, of shops, doctor's offices, hospitals, this kind of thing, I really think the Z1 is sufficient for most uses. Does that answer the question? I'm seeing more questions, so hit me with more questions.
So, yeah, we have a couple coming in. Can you also explain the difference when you shoot single DNG and DFE in the shooting setting?
Yeah. Single exposure, like the image that behind me that we're playing with, this was a dynamic scene. I'm outside, there are people walking around, and it's low light. The exposure there was a 20th of a second, which generally speaking, that's slower than you want to shoot moving people. Shooting in a bracketed panorama in that kind of dynamic situation where people are moving and the light is changing and cars are moving, et cetera, you will probably get a lot of artifacts. So a single exposure is probably better. You could shoot both and mix them together, blah, blah, blah. But generally speaking, you should use bracketing and HDR when you're in a static scene, meaning you have as little movement as possible. Trees blowing, the leaves, they get crazy in bracketing because they're not maintaining position. Moving people, moving trees, moving automobiles, flashing lights, anything like that, you should probably avoid HDR if you're shooting that kind of situation. And in that case, you would shoot a single exposure. If you're shooting indoors and you have bright windows outside, that's where you really want HDR, because that will let you get the full detail of a room. And we're going to be demonstrating that in a little bit, with the darkest corners and the bright lights and the view out the windows all in one scene. That answer questions?
I believe so. Before we dive into your next example, or maybe this is the example you show, can you show the example of single DNG and HDR DNG?
Sure. This is a single, oops, I'm sorry, I got a screen share. I just saw a question from our pal Keith Martin, but I had to jump into the screen. Okay, so this is a single exposure DNG. Let me see, I don't really have an outdoor, well, no, I do, okay. This is an HDR single exposure. I shot this outdoors. Now, I probably could have shot this as a single exposure as well, but I didn't have a lot of movement. It wasn't windy. There are no other people around, right? I felt that I had nice detail of the clouds in the sky that I wanted to capture. And we have a lot of shadow too over here, just to see what happens. This is after a bit of processing in Lightroom. This image, the HDR DNG out of camera, looks like this, right? And to, tweak it into shape in Lightroom, didn't have to use any masks here. The settings, everyone should be able to see them on screen, look something like this. Here is another single exposure shot, not HDR. Here, again, I had low light as basically I'm in blue hour, sunset, and a lot of moving people, shall we say, and I was at a 13th of a second. If I had used bracketing, HDR in this scene, I would have had a lot of ghosted people and weird artifacts. Here you can see I get motion blur because people are moving, but this is less unpleasant for the eyes, shall we say. That answer or more questions? And the final result on that one, let me just show the, whoops, where is, oh, and the final result on that one is this. And I forgot to add the, 1 second, folks, the out of camera version, which is here. This is the same shot, the exposure before I process the DNG file. And after processing the DNG file, which looked like this out of camera, oops, excuse me. DNG file out of camera looks like this, right? And by applying these settings over here, we're going to get back to this image a little later, but I get this result, which I then stitch and add some more settings. Again, we can see over here, we're going to be dealing with this more in depth later. And that's an example. More question?
All right, why don't we go into another image and workflow? Okay. Perhaps an interior shot, Sam?
Sure. Hold on 1 second. Let me jump. I need to just put this image in the right place. And webinar, boom. Okay. So, all right. We're going to move now to, we want to see a single, no, we're going to move to an HDR interior. Let's go with this one. And again, I'm sorry, 1 second. I'm not fully prepared here. Let me just get this other image out of the sorry, guys, just give me 1 second. I thought I was prepared, but all right. So here we have an interior panorama. All right, this is the final stitched equirectangular result. Whoops. Let me share the screen. Boom. Okay. So here we have a stitched equirectangular interior panorama. This is a result of the dual fisheye raw plugin, which is an add-on plugin for the Theta camera, Theta Z1 camera, which lets you create bracketed HDR files inside the camera very, very quickly, faster than any camera on Earth, basically. The Theta Z1 with the dual fisheye raw plugin will shoot a bracketed set and merge it inside the camera. So you don't have to do any HDR merging once you take your files home. This is a process not completely final file. Here we have the HDR DNG file, and I'm going to show you that. Whoops. File. This is after a bit of Lightroom, and before out of camera, it looks like this. I'm also going to show you the single exposure version, so we can see the difference between a single exposure and the HDR version in terms of what we can recover. So first, we're going to work on the, I'm going to show you a few tricks with the single exposure, and then we're going to move to the HDR. And my screen is being shared. Very good. So single exposure, we're going to just show the out of camera, we have this, and we're going to zero all the settings just for fun. Single exposure. So we want to bring the highlights up a little. We want to bring the exposure up a little bit. We want to bring the highlights down, bring up the shadows, and maybe fix the white balance a little, make it a little bluer, give it a little bit of clarity. Now the window, here we can see that the window is overexposed. This is going to happen pretty much in every interior shot where you have bright windows. How much it happens depends on which way the window's facing, which way the sun is facing, how bright the room is, what time of day it is, et cetera, et cetera. But the way you would normally deal with this is you would take a brush, masking tool. We're just going to use the most simple version right now. We're going to, sorry. We're going to uncheck auto mask. We're going to make that brush again. We're going to uncheck auto mask. We're going to make sure we're in color overlay mode. And this is just a very basic sloppy mask there. We're going to hide the mask. But now that we've created the mask, we can bring down the exposure in the windows. We can, let's zoom in on that so we can see what we're doing. Right? We can bring down the exposure. We can, bring down the highlights a little bit. We can fix the mask area. All right, this is again, not perfect, neat. This is just sloppy, quick and fast to demonstrate the technique. Enhance the shadows a little bit. It's a good idea to adjust the white balance outside the room because it'll typically be different than inside the room. So here I'm going to warm it up a little bit until the colors look right. Now, again, this is kind of sloppy. If we look at the mask, we hit the O key to hide and show the mask, right? We can fix it up a little bit. But again, I'm not trying to make it perfect here. This is just to demonstrate, quick masking on a single exposure, and we're going to show it with a HDR version in a moment. Hide the mask. Maybe give it a little bit of saturation. That is not, perfect. I can do a better job on this room, but, just for the sake of demonstration. Okay, so we're going to move to the HDR version of this, which is a merged bracketed file, which comes right out of the Z1 camera using the dual fisheye raw plugin. The Theta Z1 in its most recent firmware has built-in HDR modes that can produce an HDR DNG file directly out of the camera. That has some advantages over the dual fisheye raw plugin, and we'll discuss these options a little bit later or in another webinar. But for now, we're working with the dual fisheye raw plugin because, in my opinion, it produces the best results. This is the dual fisheye raw plugin that we've moved to now. And you can see, compared to the single exposure, there's a lot more going on. There's a lot more information in the histogram for you that know, you guys know how to read histograms. I've already applied a lot of settings to this. In our masking panel, we can see that I've already done the window and I've done a much neater job here. I could go through all this masking again live, but it would just take up a lot of time and be boring, but masking takes patience. If we zoom in a bit, right, we can see that I did not necessarily, we're going to switch the overlay mode. We can see that I didn't necessarily hit every window pane divider, but just enough to make it look good. It's going to be your own judgment and image by image what works best where. But this is my favorite feature with the new Lightroom masking tools, is this ability to see the masks as a direct black and white overlay. That's done. Good. Okay. The settings that I've given this image here, we can again see here, I brought the exposure down a little bit. I haven't really done, I haven't really done a huge amount to this image. I just played with the sliders, the basic sliders. You can see what I've done here. The exposure has been brought up 6 stops with the HDR file. You cannot do that with a single exposure. If I go back to the single exposure and I bring it up, it won't go up 6 stops, first of all. And if I try to bring it up even 3 stops, it destroys the image. We just lose everything. This is, again, the advantage of the HDR files is we have a much greater dynamic range to play with, which for most interiors is what we want. Any questions so far, or keep moving?
We had one, Sam, if you could explain the effect of brush and new function.
Yep, 1 second, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, say that again. I had to shut my fan down.
If you can explain the effect of brush and new function.
The mask functions, yeah. I'm going to be showing different uses of the mask function as I go. So that will all be as used during these this session. Next question. So yes, we're going to be seeing more from the different types of masks. Other questions, or?
Let's see, looking at the Q&A, we had a couple more. How to use brushes if possible.
Brushes.
The challenge is the boundaries between eyes.
Boundaries between eyes? I don't understand.
I'm not sure, but maybe just quick overview on brushes.
Okay, yeah. All right, let's go back to brushes then. So we just saw how to use the single brush tool, right? With the single brush tool, I was over here in the single exposure image, right? It's pretty simple. We're going to switch back. All right, maybe we're just going to do a whole big brush tutorial. Okay, welcome to the new Adobe masking brush tools. To create the mask tools, we have a bunch of options. We have a new masking panel, which, as everyone can see here, can be broken out of the main area or put back into the main area. I like to keep it in the main area myself, although we have a lot of scrolling to do. We have several new types of masks that we can play with. We have select subject, which is not that applicable to 360. So don't worry so much about that one. We have select sky, which we will use in equirectangular, but it doesn't work very well in the dual fisheye images because the sky isn't what it expects to see. We have brush, linear gradient, radial gradient, color range, luminance range, depth range. But we're going to start with, let's deal with this window with a couple of different ways with the brush. And let's do it in the HDR image just for fun. Okay, we're going to make a snapshot of that previous state. We're going to go back to the existing mask panel here. We're going to turn it off. This is what it looks like without the mask. And I'm going to make a new brush tool to deal with that. So brush tool, really quick. We have a few options. We have show overlay. So I'm going to start the brush tool here, right? and you can see it shows me that greenish area. That shows me the area the brush is affecting. The greenish color overlay can be changed to any color you like. I think red is the default, but I like green, so I keep it green. We can also show it or hide it with that show overlay checkbox, or the O, letter O like Oliver key, hides it so we can see what we're doing behind it. We have several new options here, which are completely fantastic to show what the overlay is doing. White on black lets me see that I didn't get the whole area, right? So boom, now I can fix that. That's very handy. The O key will switch back, but unfortunately it keeps me in the white on black mode. There's no way to cycle through these using a keyboard shortcut, which would be very handy, and I hope Adobe introduces very shortly. But back to the color overlay, we can see where we're painting. There's also an auto mask checkbox, right? The auto mask checkbox, let's just zoom in here a little bit. The auto mask checkbox will sometimes do a great job keeping your brush strokes where you want them and not overlapping, but not always. So try your luck. It really depends on the image. Sometimes it'll work perfectly, sometimes it won't work at all. But here we've done a bit of masking with the auto tool, auto mask selected, generally did it okay. We're going to unselect it. And here we're just going to do it sloppy all around everything, like that. If we look at the white on black mode, we can see, more what's going on here. In this case, auto mask generally did an okay job. We're going to switch out of that and back to the color overlay mode and show the color overlay. We're going to zoom in. Now we're okay with that. We're going to switch to the eraser tool in the mask. Now you can do that either by clicking erase, right? Or if you hold down the Option or Alt key while you're using the brush, it turns into the eraser. You see it changes from a plus symbol. I don't know if everyone can see that. I moved the brush over the red door now. It changes from a plus symbol to a minus symbol when it's erasing by holding down the Option key. You can also change the size of the brush with a mouse wheel. Here I'm using a mouse wheel to make the brush or the eraser larger or smaller. And you can also change the feather radius, right? And you see there are two circles here, and the feather radius is the outer circle. And that shows how the brush drops off, basically. For what I'm doing now, I like to keep it about this. And I like to keep the feather on the eraser very small, because what we're going to be doing here, erasing the areas. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention we have auto mask selected with the eraser to help keep it in bounds. With the eraser, right, we can carve out what we want from the window and get a more precise mask. Depending on how many windows and how big the room and blah, 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 this may be incredibly tedious, or it may take a few seconds. If we go back to the white on black preview, we can see that that's not bad. I missed a little bit around the edge, right? We can get that. That's usually some kind of artifact by the, whatchamacallit, auto selection. We're going to get out of that. Now that we've made these masks, right, we can bring down the exposure a little bit. We can bring the temperature to something that looks more natural and pleasing to our eye. Usually a bit of yellow and a tiny bit of purple does the trick. We can see that we're a little sloppy. This looks a little dark. We can fix that. It really doesn't take that long to make these kind of repairs. And this is similar to what's called a window pull with real estate or architectural photography, but we're not using a flash. There's no way to synchronize a flash with the Theta camera. So HDR is pretty much what you have. In my experience, this works very well with most situations. You can also do the same kind of masking in Photoshop or in other similar applications. So real quickly, go over the other tools, right? We're going to hide that mask also. We also have tools like a luminance range. You could also try a luminance range tool to select an area. And that doesn't work very well here. So don't do that. Luminance range, we can adjust it. And see if we can get it to just take the windows, which, you know, as you can see, it's actually, let me change what I just said. You know, it's another thing I forgot to mention is that the new Lightroom tools are incredibly impressive improvements over the last version, because stuff that didn't work 2 months ago now works really well. This is a much better result than the old luminance tool. But okay, so here we have selected the window with the luminance tool. We have the option of adding to the mask here. If we add, if we subtract from the luminance mask with a brush, we can get rid of the areas outside the window. So I'm going to reverse myself and say, hey, maybe this is a pretty groovy way to do these things moving forward. Okay, that was very impressive. It just gave me an excellent mask with almost no work at all with the brush. You're going to have to try see what works best. That does need a little retouching in there. So we're going to add a second brush, a plus brush, and we're going to use, whoops, we're going to go more in there to see if we hide this and change the exposure, you see that it looks funny. You see it does the areas that it didn't automatically mask, right? Those you might want to fill in with the brush. And the edges are a little strange. That could be adjusted with the luminance range, possibly. I'm going to have to play with the luminance range a little bit more, but that's a quick example of the luminance range brush. Again, not perfect, quick and dirty, more or less just showing everybody what these tools do. I kind of, in the end, seem to generally prefer using the normal brush because, you know, I'm used to it and doesn't take that long, although I'm going to be playing with the luminance masks a bit more as we move forward. As I move forward, because I'm very impressed with the results. There's also a select sky option, which you don't want to use on a fisheye image. You only want to use that on an equirectangular image. Another thing I want to mention is that this window repair, or window pull, which again, not perfect, just quick and dirty here, you really have to do this on the DNG file. Once you've converted the DNG to a stitched TIFF or JPEG, it does not contain as much information anymore to recover. So you're not going to get the same results from a TIFF or a JPEG. You really have to do this on the original raw DNG file, preferably an HDR file. More questions?
Yeah, I know you probably have one more image to go through, but if you do it on this one or the next, I'll leave that up to you. But can you also please explain workflow editing on dual fisheye and equitangular?
Yes. Okay, so let's go to something different just for fun. Let's go to, okay, this one. Yes. Okay, here's another interior image, right? This image, I've done more or less the same kind of stuff that I've given it a second to load. Because of course my computer is being slow now that it's live on the internet. Give this a moment, please. Loading, loading, loading. Anyway, here we have an image. We can see that I have, oh, come on. Okay. I need to give my drives a little kick and wake them up. This is very annoying. the drives fall asleep if I don't use them for too long. And here they've fallen asleep on me. There we go. Now the drives are awake. Quick plug for SoftRaid. Okay, so here I've already done some processing on this image. Out of camera, this is a dual fisheye raw image. Out of camera, it looks like this. This is what comes out of the camera. If we look at the histogram, we can see there's an awful lot of information in here. With basic settings, it looks like this. You can see the side of my screen there. I've given it a little bit of sharpening as well. When I'm sharpening images, I like to look at text. If you can find some books or something like that, that's a good thing to focus on while sharpening. So anyway, this is the image with no masks, no brushwork, just the basic sliders. If I move to the next phase where I've added some slider work with the brushes, this is again a little quick and dirty, blah, blah, blah. But this is a result with some sliders. Now we're going to stitch with the normal adjustments and with some masks. The masks that I've applied here, and we're going to show the masking panel really quick. I put a mask on the table because I wanted to bring up some more detail. We can see that without the mask, the marble table is a little too bright. Here, I just made it a little bit darker so we can see the detail in the marble. We have a strange shadow from the light fixture above it. We have, whoops, the windows. I masked the windows, again, not perfect, a little sloppy. But the window mask, whoops, wrong mask, window mask, sorry. The window mask, we can see what it looks like there. And the settings, right? If we hide the window mask, right? If we hide the table mask, and over here on the other side of the image, the area by the sofa, I brightened it up a little bit because it was a bit gloomy, right? So that makes the light in the room look all a bit more even. So more or less the same workflow I put in the other images, and we're going to stitch it. For everybody who's not familiar with using the RICOH THETA Z1 stitcher, it can be used as directly through Lightroom as a plugin or in standalone mode. In this case, we're going to just use it through Lightroom. I've pre-configured an export option, which instructions are available online. And we get the stitcher. And this shows me, everybody can see the stitcher window, yes? We have some options with the stitcher. Camera visibility reduction. Always turn that off, or it will create, if you look down here, it will create, it's hard to tell now, but it will create small stitching artifacts near the tripod. So if you have tiles or parquet floor, or anything on the ground with straight lines, those straight lines will get broken. Turn camera visibility reduction off. Front position adjustment lets you set the center of the panorama in case you want to change it a bit. Notice this is not perfect. I've already said that. So sorry, not perfect, not perfect stitching. I'm sorry, not perfect masking. We can also change the rotation, level the panorama. In this case, it's perfectly leveled. We don't need to do that. We can also change the stitching method. Again, we're not going to do that. We're just going to move forward and stitch it. And it's probably not going to put the stitched result here. So give me 1 second. And we're going to put that back where it belongs. And here we go. Okay, so this is what I just got out of the stitcher result, right? And we can give this in my experience, generally best to give images a two-pass approach. One, work on the DNG, and two, work more on the equirectangular image. People who want to do things quick and dirty, just shoot JPEG. shoot an HDR JPEG out of camera. It's not going to look as good as this, but you won't have to spend any time in Lightroom making it look better. If you want to get the best results, you're going to spend time in Lightroom. So here we can try auto settings, see how much that helps a little bit. We can bring down the highlights a little, bring up the shadows a bit. I like to add a little bit of clarity, maybe enhance saturation. All right, now here there's a few things. Oh, there's something strange here. There's that yellow line. That shouldn't be there. I made a mistake somewhere. Hold on. We're going to use this to demonstrate really quickly anyway, using the brush tool. Oops. Change the overlay mode back to color. There's a strange color cast here. I don't know what caused that. This yellow part, I made a mistake in the last step. But what we're going to do here, I'm going to show you how to remove color casts from white areas in a ceiling. Now, oops. We're going to hide it. If we look at this image, we see that the ceiling has a kind of yellowish color, a little bit too much over there. That's a mistake. Don't worry about that. We can give it a little bit of a blue tint to bring that down, right? And then desaturate it, right? And then we're going to do more of that. Let's go to color overlay. Whoops, show the color overlay. Excuse me, that was sloppy. Let's go into auto mask here. All right, and we're going to pretty much try to hit all of the white wall areas to remove the color casts. Again, I'm working quick and sloppy here. Anyone who's watching this goes, no, 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 you should have been neater, blah, blah, blah. I know, but this is just a quick demonstration. Once we hit these areas that should be white, hide the mask, reduce the saturation, we start to get a much more pleasing image. This needs a lot of improvement in a lot of ways. My masking on the window was sloppy, so we have a bit of overlap there. But again, we can, clean that up a little bit in post. This area, also a little gloomy, right? So we're going to give this a second mask. 1 second, please. Someone just texted me. Oops, sorry. Go to create a new mask with the brush. Make sure that auto mask is unselected. This area here just looks a little gloomy. So we're just going to give it a brush. A little bit of brush work. Doesn't have to be too neat. Hide the brush. Let's bring up the exposure a little bit. All right. Let's bring up the shadows a little bit. All right. Looks a little yellow there. So why don't we just give it a little, bring the color temperature back in line with the rest of the room. We're also going to go back to the main white mask and desaturate those a little bit more. Go back to, whoops, I was in the wrong mask there. No, this mask.
Sam, I'm just going to give you a little warning on time. Once you wrap this up, we can roll into some Q&A.
Okay, we can move right to Q&A. I mean, I can play with this, for another hour. So Q&A, please.
Great. I'll dive into a couple of these, and any that we don't get to, we can follow up after the webinar. Yeah,
people can and probably will hit me up on Facebook all the rest of the week. So I welcome this. So next.
Let's see.
There's a couple of other images I didn't get to. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I will just throw out a couple. So someone asked, Ross Simpson asked, so currently you recommended adding the HDR plugin to the Theta. Any other plugins you recommend for the Z1?
For my workflow, the dual fisheye RAW plugin is what I use for HDR. It has some disadvantages in that it does not show you a preview of what you're shooting. So you kind of have to know what you're going to be seeing through the camera. And there is currently no remote control application, which is in development, pending Apple approval, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There is an earlier version of this plugin called Dual Fisheye plugin, which does have a remote control application for Android. But the new Dual Fisheye RAW plugin shoots an entire bracket sequence in less than 1 second, which is astonishing. It's much faster. So I recommend the Dual Fisheye RAW, and I use a 10-second timer. Hit the timer button and, you know, hide behind a wall. Next question.
We've had a couple people ask a little bit more about your shooting settings. You know, for certain scenarios, do you have any favorites, you know, that you would use?
Yeah, I always, a couple of basic tips, and I'm going to switch back to screen sharing for this. 1 second, please.
For example, someone asked what mode and exposure were those dark looking originals shot at?
Manual exposure. I only shoot in manual exposure, and I always keep my ISO as low as possible. Here we see you're looking at a JPEG, out of camera JPEG, 1/13 second f2.1, ISO 80. Keeping a low ISO is important for preserving maximum dynamic range. You might want to bring the ISO up a little bit if you're capturing action, people are moving in low light, etc. It depends on the dynamic range of the image. But here is a JPEG out of camera shot in manual mode. I underexposed probably about 2 stops. Here is the DNG. Whoops. Here's the DNG out of camera. And here's the DNG after a bit of processing. We can see the settings in the side. And I can't remember if I used any masks on this. Nope, no masks on that. And here is the final stitched image. And I did use some masks here. And I'm going to just show those masks really quick because I forgot to demonstrate earlier the select sky tool really fast. If you have an equirectangular with a clear sky like this, it will just do a fantastic job of selecting your sky, you know, without need to, you know, play with it too much. Once you've selected the sky, you can do anything you want with it. You want a red sky, you want a purple sky, you want a green sky, yellow sky, it's all there, boom. You can also invert the sky mask and use that to adjust the rest of the image. Here I selected the sky. There I just made a copy of it. We're gonna get rid of that copy I just made. But here's the original mask. Here I inverted the mask to adjust, whoops, sorry. This is the inverted version, and that's the, no, this is the inverted version. Anyway, you can invert the mask and, right, invert the mask to affect the areas which are not sky. This gives, you know, this is, begins to approach Ansel Adams' zoning situation. So moving on, next question.
All right.
Wow, time flies, huh?
I know we've got about 5 minutes left and there's a lot of questions, so we can follow up after. We have a couple about how you organize the rotational orientation of the camera when you're taking specific shots. You know, do you focus the center of the lens or orient the lenses like towards the light source, such as a window?
I try to, there's a couple of things. The center of the lens is the sharpest part of the lens. So if I don't want important detail to be on a seam where the two images overlap, because that's a little bit softer, the very center of the lens is really the sharpest part. So I want to focus that on the most important part of the image. Light, sometimes if you have a bright light source shining directly into one side but not hitting the other, you can get strange flares, etc. This can be minimized by keeping your lenses perfectly clean at all times. but generally speaking, try to keep the center of the lens where you want the most detail. Try to avoid having important detail near and along seams.
Got it. And I think we've got time for maybe one more. I don't know, Sam, if you've looked at any and you have any favorites you want to answer here in the
Hold on a
QA.
second. Where do I see the chat? I haven't even looked at the chat. Participants, we got 84 participants. Oh, there's the chat. Okay. Oh boy. Okay.
You got a Q&A?
Oh, do I have a Q&A? Hold on. Where's Q&A? Okay, boom. We want settings for shooting, not editing. Okay, for shooting, Bram Lamens. For shooting, I use manual mode and I keep my ISO as low as possible. And I use the pre-camera preview to show the exposure and show me that I'm underexposed as much as I want, so the highlights are not blown out. With the dual fisheye raw plugin, there's no manual control. It only does auto exposure. And to be completely honest, Yoichi Hirota, who programmed this, is a bloody genius, because the auto exposure on the HDR plugin has never let me down. I'm a diehard manual exposure guy, and the dual fisheye raw plugin auto exposure, it just works perfectly all the time. Can't complain. So test shots with 9DNG raw. I don't have any test shots right now. Batch shooting, how long it takes for me to edit a pano. It can take anywhere from 10 minutes to a couple of days, depending on the image, the mood. Supportive 360 in Lightroom. You cannot view interactive in 360 when you use brushes, when you need them. Are there any manual plugins? The dual fisheye raw plugin from Yoichi Hirota is the plugin I recommend. Apply correction and brush mask before HDR, both before, no, not before merging, but on the HDR file and in the final stitched equirectangular. Corrections 2 times, before stitching and after stitching. Currently recommend adding HDR to the Z1. Yes. A simple way to trigger DFR Z1 iPhone with a Bluetooth trigger. No, not yet. Stay tuned. That's from Dan. Hani Dre from Riyadh. Sometimes need breaking to hide the photographer. People asking about hiding in the photo. With the 360 camera, I hide behind a wall. There's a plugin that lets you shoot one side and then the other, but I either squat down on the ground so I can Photoshop myself out on the ground. I'm very small and skinny, or I jump behind a wall. I'm also very quick. That's what I do. You could also shoot twice, moving yourself around, and Photoshop yourself out of one of them. Brian, thank you. You're welcome. Peter, 20 more panoramas. Theta Stitcher, Adobe Lightroom had the problem. They don't stitch all panos. Batch stitching bug. You should report that to RICOH. I'm not sure exactly why. Shoot with the Z1 while it's charging. Yes, you can shoot with the Z1 while it's plugged in to a battery. Keep it running all day. Best way to get rid of the photographer when shooting panos outdoors. I lie down on the ground or squat down on the ground and then Photoshop myself out of the nadir. Any recommendations of alternative to Lightroom? You can use alternatives to Lightroom. You can use Affinity Photo. You can use Darktable. There are many. I like Lightroom. I like Nikon. You can use Canon. You can wear Nike. You can wear Adidas. They all do the same thing. When I use a DSLR, that's another question really, but basically when I'm on a job where the client wants DSLR results. Stitching with the official stitcher or PT GUI, both are good. Usually I use a stitcher because it's simpler. Anything else?
Right.
I think I got
that was rapid fire Q&A, Sam. I think you got to most of them.
Damn. I feel like I'm just getting started. Let's go another hour.
Thank you, Sam, so much for your time and your tips, everyone, and thank you for attending. We will share a recording out of this webinar following this. So if you want to refer back, you're more than welcome to. And if you have any other questions, you can hit up Sam on Facebook and he will answer them for you.
Ask me in my Facebook group, Panoramic Photographers on Facebook. Everyone knows the group. better than PM. If you send me PMs, my PMs get too long and I never answer any of them. So ask in the group, and that way everyone benefits from the answer. Thanks very much, everybody who made it. I'm really glad. And we'll be seeing you all again on the next one.
Thanks, everyone.
Boom.